What's up, everybody? Welcome back. We are here with some more UFC DFS picks and lineup advice, FanDuel, DraftKings best bets, lineup advice, picks, everything you need to crush Saturday's card. Again, UFC Vegas 75, Marvin Vettori, Jared Cannonier. Welcome. I'm Brian Jester, co-founder here at Occupy Fantasy, joined as always by Jake the Snake, owner of MMA DFS.com. Jake, we're banging out videos multiple weeks in a row. It feels weird after all the 11 fight cards and one of us being out of town or whatnot. So feels good to talk to you again for the second week in a row.
Yeah, man, we're cutting it close to get down to 11 this week after we had 14 yesterday afternoon.
Dude, we joked about it, whatever, I think it was last week, whenever Jared Gordon was fighting. In our video, we joked that you and I were saying no one ever drops out on Thursday. Gordon dropped out that same week on Thursday, and then we get two Thursday dropouts this week just for the universe to say you guys are never on top of things. So we're now down to 12 fights. And if you're new here, welcome. What we do is we break down the main event from a betting and DFS perspective. Let's talk about newcomers to the Octagon. There are none since one fight was canceled that had the only newcomer on the card. We play good fighter, bad fighter, good matchup, bad matchup, which will be integral to this video in this slate because basically the entire card is filled with fighters who have less than 4 UFC fights under their belt. We're going to give some context to their stats. When I first saw the card, I don't know if you're like me, Jake, but I saw it and I said, we should have a pretty decent edge. Wish we had 14 fights, but given all the work we do and the reliance that the field will have on the only stats that are available, I feel pretty good about that aspect of the slate.
Yeah, man, I totally agree. I was pulling a lot of the old regional stats for these guys with one fight, and a lot of the industry projections are going to be basing it just off that one fight, which sometimes is a couple minutes of fight time. For guys like Bonder or something like 80 seconds of fight
Yeah.
time. So I think there are a lot of edges for people that do their own charting on sites like this.
Yeah, we have multiple fighters who finished their debut in round one, multiple fighters who lost and were controlled on the ground. We have some fighters that were on short notice debut against a top 10 opponent, all kinds of ranges of outcomes. We had an injury to their opponent mid fight in the first round. So the stats are so minor compared to their overall picture. So I'm excited to dive into that with you. And again, if you're new, at the end of the show, we talk about a fight that you have to target for DFS, our favorite prize picks play, and then a stream betting parlay. So Jake, let's jump into it. 12 fights, Cannonier, Vittori. When we have these sorts of main events, it feels like we know what's going to happen. We feel have a tighter range of outcomes for the main event. Just talk to me about Vittori versus Cannonier, how you expect it to play out, and then more importantly, what we can expect from a DFS perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty straightforward, everyone knows who these guys are. Jared Cannonier, big, powerful guy, started his career at heavyweight, came down to light heavyweight. Now he's at 185 pounds. Really good takedown defense since moving down to 185, 80% takedown defense. When he has been taken down, really good at getting back up. So that's a really strong attribute to have when you're facing a grappler like Marvin Vettori, who generally is looking to take people down, but not always. We've seen Vettori even in his last fight and at multiple points against Hermanson, against some other guys, against Paulo Costa, where he's content with keeping it striking. And then you'll see, fights like where he's fighting Kevin Holland and he lands 11 takedowns. So, Vettori can do it all. I think in this fight he's going to need to because Cannonier is going to be a really tough guy to take down. So I think Vettori is basically going to have another striking heavy approach. Maybe he'll mix in a takedown attempt or two, but it's going to be tough to land him. So he's going to be trying to outland Cannonier. It's going to be a volume approach. Pretty straightforward. The fight's supposed to go the distance. I think last I checked, it was negative 165 to go the distance, like 58% chance. And I would say, honestly, what Vettori has gone the distance like 12 of his last 13 fights or something stupid outside of that one submission win over Carl Robertson, who everyone submits. Really good shot. He goes the distance. And even Cannonier, who's known for his power, I believe he's gone the distance in 4 of his last 5 fights. 3 of those have been 5-round decisions. And he's coming off a split decision win over Sean Strickland, where he set a career best 141 significant strikes landed. He still only scored 86 DraftKings points because he's not really adding anything in terms of grappling. It's just striking. And if he's not landing knockouts, he's not putting up big scores. And even when he does land knockouts, they're typically coming in the middle rounds and not coming with big scores anyway. So he's pretty much dependent on like a first round knockout, well-timed second round knockout, or multiple knockdowns. And he's facing a guy in Vettori who's never been knocked out, never even been knocked down in his career. And 14 UFC fights, which is pretty impressive. So tough spot for Cannonier to score well. I think Vettori can be a little bit busier with his striking. And we also saw the line flip in his favor. So now he's 8K. He's at a negative 125 favorite. Cannonier opened at, a pick 'em basically in the week, and now he's plus 105. So slight underdog, slightly overpriced. $200 difference isn't going to make a huge impact. But I think what will make a bigger impact is Vettori can be more active. He might be able to land a takedown or two. Maybe he can get some cage control or something. Historically, he has scored well, but this is a much tougher matchup than in the times where he's scored well. So I think he can score better than Cannonier, but I don't think he's going to score as well as he had in previous 5-round fights. So both guys are kind of value plays, a little bit more of a ceiling for Vettori. And because of that, I think either guy could bust. I think it's easier for Cannonier to bust in this fight in tournaments. So if Cannonier wins a decision or even gets like a 3rd-round knockout, he could get left out of the winning tournament lineups. Vettori, it's a little bit easier for him to serve as a value play. So I'm going to have more exposure on the Vettori side. But I still think even with him, it's not impossible. We get a high-scoring slate, and whoever wins this fight gets left out. So you don't have to have a piece in high-risk lineups. And in low-risk lineups on DraftKings, we were talking earlier, I think you still stack it. It's not like a dream matchup just because, it's not going to be probably not going to be an insanely high volume. I mean, every time we say that, you get like 9 points.
You get Mackenzie Dern, Angela Hill, which I still love.
Right. right. Yeah. I mean, get whatever gets you into the live final, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, but you still stack it. It's just not like my favorite low-risk slate ever.
Fair enough. That's totally fair. And so obviously we see the ceiling with Vettori. I feel like the field will know that too, especially with the line flip. What's the latest ownership projection you have on DraftKings for these two guys?
So right now we have Cannonier at 33% and Vettori at 38%. I wouldn't be shocked if that gets a little wider with Vettori, creeping up into the low 40s and Cannonier in the high 20s. Historically the field has kind of liked Cannonier despite his struggles. So we'll see. We'll do another update on ownership projections tonight or in the morning, and we'll see what shakes out. And if the line gets a little bit wider, that'll affect it too. But yeah, I mean, definitely could be right. I mean, we'll see what happens with that.
But either way, I'm just bringing it to the point that I agree with you in that this has a higher chance, and the field isn't necessarily recognizing that. I understand it's a 12-fight card, but I think there is merit to going underweight, which is something we normally do anyways, but way underweight on this main event. Easier way to get different on a 12-fight card. But as you and I were talking together earlier, this isn't your typical 12-fight card because the ownership is so wide that it's not spread out like we've seen on some of the most recent cards where it's hard to find lower owned differentiators in GPPs. Not the case this week.
Yeah, I mean, we have guys, Arman Sarukian obviously is sucking up so much of that expensive ownership. The guy projects to be a little bit over 60% owned. And then you have Manuel Torres taking a bunch of ownership. You have Ronnie Lawrence taking a bunch of ownership. And after that, it really dropped that off after the main event and those 3 guys. So, yeah, we have a ton of low-owned options. We just need some of them to hit and some of these, super high-owned options not to go crazy. And this could actually be a decent 12-fight card.
Yeah, we have tons of lower ownership, and we have what we think is a great edge in our knowledge of the fighters making their 2nd, 3rd, 4th fights in the UFC, which is a great transition. Professionalism at its best. Let's talk about those fighters, and we'll play good fighter, good matchup, bad matchup. If you're new here, what we do is we talk about the fighter. Very simply, Jake says whether they're actually good or bad as a fighter and whether there's a good or bad matchup for them in terms of DFS scoring to give some context to their stats. So, Jake, we'll start with the earliest fight of the night and we'll go all the way down to the last fight of the night. In the first fight, we have Zach Pauga making his 3rd UFC fight. Is he good or bad? And is this a good or bad matchup against Modestas Bukakas?
Yeah, he's definitely bad. I think it's a bad matchup. I think both guys are a little bit lower volume, and I think Modestas could definitely knock him out.
Fair enough. All right, sucks for Pauga. Next, we have Dan Argueta, who tough spot in his debut, up a weight class. We talked about that guy we wanted to target in this 2nd fight. Rightfully, we get that. He scores 101 points, so high five to us. We were all over that. Now he's making his 3rd fight. Is he good or bad after seeing him twice in the octagon? And is this a good or bad matchup against Ronnie Lawrence?
Yeah, I mean, he's like a decent wrestler, but I still think he's a bad fighter, and now he's dropping down to 135, where I think he probably should have been there all along. He had 3 LFA fights just before making his debut at 135, but I think it's a tough cut for him, man. I think like this guy would be perfect for like a 140 division. He was the last guy to weigh in. He had sunglasses on. It was like he didn't look like death or anything, but not great signs. It's an interesting matchup, right? Because we just saw Ronnie Lawrence get absolutely dominated on the mat by Kakramanov. And Kakramanov's way better than Dan Argueta, but it at least shows that when Ronnie Lawrence faces another wrestler, he might struggle because he's been beating up on one-dimensional strikers. So I think it could be a sneaky good matchup for Argueta, especially when you factor in ownership as a leverage play. But at the same time, he could also just get ragdolled. So I think it's a high volatile matchup with some high upside, low floor, but I don't think he's a great fighter.
That's fair enough. And speaking to the wrestling, I remember you saying last week on this show that wrestling has a lot of variance in it when you have two wrestlers against each other. In that video, we were particularly talking about Jazz Davicius and Maverick. And you mentioned that could go Jazz Davicius' way, even though the assumption, given the betting odds, was that Maverick had the advantage on the ground. And then we saw how that goes. So you never know. The same could go here as well. All right, moving on. We have 2 fighters in their second UFC fights. We have Gabby Fernandez and Sarasa Bleda, both which lost in their UFC debut. Bleda for sure against tough competition. Jazavicius proven to be a little tougher than maybe we originally thought. But Fernandez, Bleda, are they good or bad? And is it a good or bad matchup for either?
So I think they're both kind of bad in the sense that they both have glaring holes. Bleda's giant and she's good at wrestling, but she has terrible cardio and terrible striking. And on the flip side, Fernandez is pretty decent striker, but absolutely terrible defensive wrestling. So it's like stylistically, it's a good matchup for both of them. And I say that because Bleda should have a massive wrestling advantage, but if she gasses out, Fernandez should be like completely teed up to get a late round finish. And all of her recent finishes have come late in fights. So she's shown that she can land late round finishes. So if Bleda gasses out like she did against Natalia Silva, then I think we could see a teed up matchup or a teed up finish for Fernandez. And while that might not put up a huge score if it gets controlled early on, she's 6,700 on DraftKings. So if she scores like 90 points in like a second or third round knockout, she could potentially still score well. And if Bleda improves her cardio, she could absolutely maul her on the entire mat. So great matchup for both of them, I think.
Yeah, and I will say, so Fernandez 6,700, the line has moved in her favor. I think she'll be much more popular in smaller contests and even in cash games compared to her large field ownership. And while we want to take advantage of that in some sense, I'm not sure you can really trust a 9,400, 9,500 female MMA fighter in her second fight with glaring weaknesses. But Bleda's going to have super low ownership in all contest types, Jake.
Yeah, man, I think she's an interesting pivot off of Sarukian because if she has, if she's improved her cardio and if she dominates this fight on the mat, I mean, she's got like 130 point DraftKings potential if she stays active on the ground, landing ground and pound. It doesn't just lay on top of Fernandez the whole fight.
Fair enough. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about Dennis Bondar, who you mentioned previously. Got his arm snapped by Malcolm Gordon in his debut after being highly touted. And he's fighting Carlos Hernandez, who only has a couple fights in the octagon as well. Are these guys good or bad? Is this a good or bad matchup for either?
Yeah, I think Hernandez is like decent, well-rounded fighter. Kind of struggles with his wrestling, both offensively in terms of his accuracy and defensively just getting taken down. But overall, pretty well-rounded. Coming off his first career early loss, can't really blame him. Really tough matchup. Got submitted in the first round by Nascimento. And now he's facing Dennis Bondar, who's a complete wild card. Bondar hasn't fought in 16 months since getting his arm broken by Malcolm Gordon. He got wobbled like 30 seconds into that fight by Malcolm Gordon, which is never a good sign. And he fought his entire pre-UFC career on the Ukrainian regional scene, which has produced multiple fraudulent fighters in recent years, which I think is somewhat concerning. But when he was fighting in those fights, he looked absolutely dominant on the mat. So if he can, come back, healed up, and look like he did on the regional scene, massive scoring upside. And Hernandez has shown that he struggles to defend takedowns. Bondar's constantly looking to get fights to the ground and finish people on the mat. So high upside, but I would say low floor for Bondar because if he is a fraud, then maybe he has no striking defense, and maybe Hernandez comes in, pieces him up, and finishes him. I'm really interested in seeing how this fight plays out, and I don't have a great read on Bondar at this point. I was I was higher on him, like a lot of people coming in based on how he looked in the regional scene. But over the last 16 months, we've seen several of these Ukrainian guys come
Yeah.
in and just like so many of them flop that it's not a great look for Bonder looking back.
For sure. And it has to be noted that the line has moved significantly in Bondar's favor. He is the most mispriced fighter on the card. He'll be extremely popular in all contest types, which gives even more merit to the idea of playing Hernandez against him. Really, in any contest type, maybe not the smallest contest, but Jake, I don't see how it's possible that Hernandez comes in with higher ownership as a higher price guy here.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, Bonder, you look at me, 7,900 on DraftKings, and now his line's at negative 135. I mean, DraftKings kind of dropped the ball there because the line was already moving on
Right.
Monday. I don't know, they should have seen that Bonder was going to flip, and at least, I don't know, they should have priced it like worst case scenario 8,100 each. But they probably, if they had much foresight, they would have made Bonder the favorite. Like
Right.
the line flipped on Monday. It didn't just flip like yesterday, but whatever. I mean, it is good for tournaments. I think Hernandez is a solid tournament play now.
Fair enough. They could just wait till Thursday, like we suggested. I'll be on their ear in Jacksonville, so don't worry. So, all right, moving on. We have Christian Quinones, who got a first-round finish in his debut. So he's one of those guys that have just a couple minutes of octagon time, a couple minutes of stats under his belt. Is he good or bad? Is this a good or bad matchup against Gong?
I was lower on him coming in, and I think I was biased because his brother's terrible. But I rewatched, like I kind of started on scratch from him, even though I had already charted once. I was like, I'm gonna, remove my biases. I went and rewatched his regional tape, went and rewatched his debut. I think he's actually pretty decent, man.
Okay.
He's got good footwork. He moves well. He's still like a one-dimensional striker, pretty much, but he has good takedown defense. I think he's a pretty decent fighter, and maybe I'm just tilted because I was like not on him in his debut, and then of course he lands like a first round knockout against Taha. But I think he's actually pretty decent. It's a tough matchup though, man. Kang's good, and he's got a way better ground game here than Quinones. So I think he's gonna have to keep the fight standing, and he might be in trouble if the fight hits the mat because Kang is definitely good at controlling guys on the mat, and he's shown that in the past that he can just grind out decisions or get submissions on the ground. So I don't think it's an easy matchup for Quinones, and I don't love him in DFS, but I think he's a pretty solid fighter. But I think it's a bad matchup.
Fair enough. All right, moving on. We have one of the most volatile fights on the card. We have Alessandro Costa against Jimmy Flick. Costa, if you remember correctly, came in short notice. Took Amir Albazi to the third round. Everyone expected him to get finished in the first round. So excellent effort there, all things considered. Fighting Jimmy Flick, who just lives for finishes on one end or the other. So Costa versus Flick. All right, is either of these guys good? Is this a good matchup or a bad matchup for either of them?
Costa looked pretty bad in his debut, but I think a lot of that can be written off because he was fighting Amir Albazi. I think he's actually pretty decent. He's another guy where like I'd already charted him once, I'd already completely scouted him. I kind of went back to square one. I was like, all right, let me get a new feel for this guy. Like when I'm not biased, like he's on his short notice debut
Right.
against Amir Albazi. Obviously, I went into that one thinking that like this guy's definitely losing. So I wanted to get a fresh take on him. I think he's actually pretty decent. He trains with like Aldana and Grasso and Diego Lopez down at Lobo Gym in Mexico, even though he's Brazilian. He's got a black belt. He's got good arm bars, but he's generally relying on striking, lower volume, but heavy hands. So I mean, in a great spot here to knock out Flick early. And I think being a black belt, he'll have the skills needed to not get submitted. So I think it's a really good matchup for Costa, who generally probably isn't going to be great in DFS just because of his lack of striking volume and takedowns. But I mean, this is a dream matchup, man. I think it's a great spot. And coming off the round 3 TKO loss, I mean, even better. We should get him at lower ownership. Really good bounce back spot for Costa.
Okay, and Flick, is he actually good or bad? And I imagine, given Costa's inexperience, it's probably still a good matchup for him, especially at his price.
Yeah, I think Flick is terrible, but he's obviously a really dangerous submission threat. But if we're talking about like as an MMA fighter, nah, he's not good, man. CrossFit Flick is not a good MMA fighter. And for anyone that doesn't get that reference, I was just listening to a Jimmy Flick interview, and he was talking about how he's training at like 3 different places, and one of them's like a CrossFit gym. I was like, all right, that makes sense now.
Yep, all makes sense. All comes together. All right, so Jimmy Flick, CrossFit Flick at 6,800. All right, moving on. We have another matchup of fighters with just a couple fights under their belt. We have Manuel Torres, who, like Quinones, got a finish in the early first round in his debut against Camacho, and he's fighting Nicholas Mota, who has 2 fights. He has a second round KO loss and a first round KO win. So not a ton of stats on these guys. Thoughts on either? Good or bad? Is this a good or bad matchup?
Man, how quickly things turn on Torres, man. I was so ready to bet Trey Ogden against Manuel Torres,
I
and
know.
Torres dropped out during
I
weigh-ins,
know.
which maybe saved me some money. Who knows? But I'm kind of all in on Torres in this spot, man. I think this is the type of fight where Torres can really excel.
Yeah.
It's like night and day from that last Trey Ogden fight. Like Trey Ogden, like never gets knocked out, boring fights, can grapple. Moda, one-dimensional striker, gets knocked out a bunch, can't grapple.
Yeah.
I think Torres, if he wants to, he can grapple and get a finish that way. If he wants to strike, I think he's the more explosive striker. I mean, Torres has a quick expiration date, man. I think he has like 3 or 4 minutes of cardio, and after that, we don't know what happens because he's only been out of the first round like once. But I can't imagine he would look good in the second round. So if this fight makes it past round one, Torres is going to turn into a pumpkin. But man, I really like him to get the first round finish, and I would not be shocked if it comes really quickly. But we'll see. So explosive, one-dimensional first-round fighter. I don't know if that's a good fighter. He's a fun fighter. He's a dangerous fighter. He's not going to find long-term success only having one round of cardio. I'll tell you that. But in these matchups, before he faces tougher opponents, it's great for DFS, great matchup. And then on the other side for Moda, like the guy literally just needs to survive for 5 minutes, and then he could be looking at like a Fiallo type deal where it's just like a guy out on his feet that he can just knock down. I don't think Moda's that good, man. I think he's kind of chinny. He's a decent boxer, but he's kind of one-dimensional. He drops out of a bunch of fights. Got knocked out by Jim Miller in his debut. Like he's a decent striker. He's got decent striking, but I think he's the worst striker in this fight. I think he's a smaller guy. I think he's going to be a little bit slower, but he's definitely got a chance for a knockout if he can survive the opening minutes.
And I imagine should be lower ownership against Torres, who should be extremely popular given the inside the distance numbers, right?
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing. Like Moda's a good leverage play. He's going to be half the ownership of Torres. I mean Torres could even creep up higher than that. I think that people get really excited when they see a guy like Torres with all the first round finishes.
And you mentioned Torres, likely no future success. So, guys, go ahead and get those future champion bets in for Manuel Torres after you watch this video. And Jake, we have 2 more fighters. I mean, there's just a million fighters on this card that have not fought a bunch. Lucas Almeida, who in a crazy fight against Michael Trezano, got the comeback win. Is he good or bad? And is this a good or bad matchup against Pat Sabatini?
He's another guy who's like a fun fighter. He looked a bit shitty in his last fight.
Yeah.
Trezano almost knocked him out in the first round. Almeida looks super tall at face-offs against Sabatini. He's like towering over him.
Dude, I thought it was the
guy's a
camera angle.
beanpole.
That shit was crazy. I didn't realize how tall he was, or at least the optics of how tall he was compared to Sabatini.
Right, Sabatini's like staring at his neck. But yeah, I don't know, man. On Almeida, I think he's like one of these guys that's all offense. Like technically he's like a black belt. I think he's like a black belt in BJJ, kickboxing, Muay Thai, like all sorts of stuff. But he's all offense. He's there to brawl. Like I don't think he has very good defensive wrestling, which obviously isn't great for this type of matchup. But I think he's got decent defensive grappling, so maybe he can avoid getting submitted. So maybe he'll have 3 opportunities to land a knockout at the beginning of each round. I mean, we'll see. Sabatini's a really good grappler, but Sabatini has looked chinny, man. He almost got knocked out by Jamal Emmers.
Yep.
He just got knocked out, in his last fight. I mean, that was not a good look when you're taking on a grappler and then you get knocked out. But maybe he just wasn't prepared for the striking in that fight. So we'll see. I think Lucas Almeida has a puncher's chance to land a knockout, but I think he's going to have limited windows to do it before he gets taken down.
Fair enough.
I don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I don't even know if he's good or not. I don't know if he's good or not, but he's good for DFS offensively.
Which is all we care about generally. So, all right, finally we have CLD, Christian Duncan, who fought your boy Dushko, got the round 1 win. On that slate, I faded Duncan because all of our research showed that likely no takedowns, likely low volume, just had to somehow survive a round 1 finish. And he got the best case scenario with no knockdown, I will say. But I will say, maybe 15 seconds into that fight, I was like, shit, I made the wrong decision. Because he looked like it looked like there was zero chance Dushko was getting out of round one based on how Duncan looked in that fight. So to me, he was better than anticipated. Uh, Give me your thoughts on Duncan. Is he good or bad? And this should be one of the more interesting battles on the card against Arman Petrosian. Two strikers. Petrosian's obviously very decorated in that department as well. So I'm curious to see how you think this fight plays out and how Duncan fares in this matchup.
Yeah, I think Duncan's a good fighter. You know, he's really athletic. He's got like a basketball background. I think he said he was like playing point guard, which like what team was he on?
Yeah,
But like
size for days.
Ray just dunking on everyone.
Yeah,
Literally dunking.
boom.
Um, yeah, no pun intended. But yeah, I mean, he really did. Like as soon as that fight started, I agree with you. It's like, are these guys even in the same weight class? Like Duncan was huge.
Yeah,
I mean, he was so big that like Dushko's knee just exploded just trying to clinch with him. You just couldn't even hang with him.
right.
Um, my concerns with Duncan is just he's lower volume. He generally doesn't add much in terms of grappling, but if he was ever gonna, you know, he'll mix in like one takedown. If he was ever gonna mix in more than his normal one takedown here and there, this would be the fight to do it. Because I mean, Petrosian's probably one of the worst grapplers in the division. I mean, so helpless with his defensive wrestling. But we'll see.
Goes with the Slava
We'll see
clause
if that.
defense mechanism of takedown defense.
Oh my god, those guys must train together, man. It's just like so helpless. Like honestly, that's a really good comp for them because they're both really good strikers and just so helpless when they get taken down. And it's like, how are you in MMA? Like, just go back to
Right.
kickboxing if you're not even going to learn to wrestle defensively. But it'll be interesting to see if Duncan shoots for a takedown because if he doesn't, I don't know if he has the volume to keep up with Petrosian. Both guys have a ton of power. They could each knock the other one out. They've both been fairly durable though, so I don't know if we're really going to see a knockout. It's possible. Let's see what happens. I think they're both good. I'm interested to see how the fight goes, and I think Petrosian's volume gives him an edge over Duncan. But both guys are super live, and I think they're both really good, dangerous strikers.
Agree. Definitely agree. All right. I think we got them all 30 of those fighters. So let's move on and let's finish out the show here. If you guys have liked what you've seen so far, make sure you give us a thumbs up. That lets us know to continue to make these videos. If you like the MMA videos, you giving us a thumbs up lets us know, hey, keep making these videos every single week. So go ahead and do that for us. If you're not subscribed already here on YouTube, it's free to do. Just click subscribe. You'll get notified whenever we go live or upload any UFC DFS videos. If you have any questions, comments, you want to see something else in these shows, or you have predictions, we always love hearing predictions. If you guys make a great prediction, we'll call it out in the next week's video. So drop a comment below with your predictions or any comments about the show. So, Jake, let's finish it out with fight you have to target in DFS, a prize picks play, and our stream parlay. So quickly, DFS fight. Whoever wins is likely to score extremely well. There's a couple easy ones here, a couple low hanging fruit. But who are you gonna pick?
Yeah, I'm going to take the easiest of the fruit. I'll go with Costa and Flick.
Easy enough. Cost and Flick, which is a great precursor to our stream parlay in the next segment. But for now, Jake, your favorite prize picks play. Remember, you can use promo code OCCUPY at prizepicks.com to get a 100% deposit match bonus up to $100. Parlay all of your favorite props together. Jake's been killing it ever since he started covering prize picks play. So, Jake, who's your favorite prize picks play this week?
I think the Manuel Torres fight under 6.5 minutes. You have to like that, you know. I think that's pretty solid there.
Fair enough. We are flying through these. Let's close out the show with our stream parlay of the week. And we've already talked about both of these, so it's not going to be a surprise for anyone. My side, Jake, I will go with Costa and Flick under 1.5 rounds, relatively even money. Not a lot of great long shot bets this week, at least in my eyes. So we're playing for the quote unquote safer parlay this week. So who are you pairing it up with?
Yeah, this is a weird betting slate. It's like the lines you want to bet are all really like well made. I feel like the lines are pretty on point on the slate. Just not a ton of, like you said, not a ton of long shots, but I'm gonna go with a safer one too. I'm gonna go Petrosian's money line at plus 135. We've seen these small underdogs do really well compared to their implied odds, and I know it's moved some. Ideally, you know, if you were betting it, you would have gotten in a little bit earlier in the week, but still, I think it should be a coin flip at worst. I think he's gonna outvolume him. I mean, I'm just waiting for CLD to come in and land like 3 takedowns, one in every round, 15 minutes of control time, grind out a decision. But as long as that doesn't happen, I think Petrosian's super live here to most likely win a decision, but he could land a knockout, which is why I'm betting a money line opposed to one of his props. So plus 135, that gives us plus 339 on the parlay.
All right, plus 339. We'll take that. Buy us some lunch and dinner here and there. So let's finish it out here. You can follow Jake's work at MMADFS.com, where he writes the sheet every single week, breaks down every fight from a betting and DFS perspective. Make sure you go check that out. He has the archive where you can go back and look at historical DFS slates. That's always invaluable. And he has his premium content, which he gets out to his members over there. Bets earlier in the week. You don't want to miss out on that. So MMADFS.com is where you can find that info. OccupyFantasy.com is where you can find Jake's The Plug. Gives us top plays, lineup construction tips, favorite remaining bets on the week, some prize picks plays, everything, all encompassing slate information. That's at OccupyFantasy.com. Our Occupy model ranks every fighter, FanDuel, and DraftKings using projected ownership, using our proprietary charted fight data. No one else has it, so make sure you check that out. And our lineup builder allows you to build up to 300 UFC DFS lineups using our optimal lineup criteria. So I think that covers it. Again, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you are liking the video and drop a comment with predictions or thoughts on this YouTube series. So for Jake at DFS_MMA, I'm at Brian Jester FF. We appreciate you listening as always, and good luck at UFC Vegas 75.